Coming up on This Week in Radio Tech, Gary Liebisch is our guest. We're talking about some fun things, including radio's funny top 10 having to do with WWV, some advice on water-cooled, liquid-cooled, or air-cooled transmitters, and more funny stuff and funny stories from the trenches with Gary Liebisch on TWiRT. This Week in Radio Tech is brought to you by Broadcasters General Store with outstanding service, savings, and support online at bgs.cc. By the Ruby console from Lavo. See Lavo in your future at lavo.com/TWiRT. And by Angry Audio. Audio problems disappear when you get angry at angryaudio.com. Hey friends, welcome into This Week in Radio Tech. It's the show where we talk about everything from the microphone to the light bulb at the top of the tower and all the digital and analog stuff that's all in between. And today we've got a show that I am really eager about. I know I say that almost every week. If I don't say that, you should worry, right? Because today our guest is Gary Liebisch. We'll bring him on in a minute, but Gary Liebisch recently retired from Nautel. He's been doing all the exit interviews, radio world interviews, Gary, and what does he see for the future and what's it been like? And we get to talk real time to Gary for an hour. And Gary has some fun stories for us, some tales from the trenches, some fun, some embarrassing, some maybe he couldn't tell until now, because now he's he's not depending on a paycheck from an employer. But then we'll also have some serious stuff. Gary has some very serious advice to give, especially in this day and age of low power FMs and translators. He's got some hardware advice that you're going to want to stick around for. So that's what's coming up. I'm Kirk Harnack. I work for the folks at the Telos Alliance. And this is the Telos Alliance studio. See, that's where I am today on almost every show. I thank the Telos Alliance for making it possible for me to take an hour out of every Thursday and do the show. It's really great. Sometimes I use Telos Alliance gear to get the show done. And sometimes we talk about it too. So I appreciate their wealth of technical information and all their helpfulness in me getting this show done. Our show, we'll get to our sponsors in a few minutes. Right now, let's bring in my co-host, Chris Tobin. Is in, I don't know where he is today. Chris, welcome in. How are you?
I'm fine. I'm just in our performance space, which is actually nothing on the walls. We're doing nothing right now. We're in between sessions, and we'll be doing some videotaping tomorrow night at a club. So we're getting ready for that. So there's not much going on here in the studios today.
Is this the room that that until recently had a menorah and a Christmas tree in the background?
Yes, that is correct. Yes,
okay.
Yes. We reset the room. We're back to normal operations.
Wait a minute. I've got to put this thing on mute. All right. So you had to say, Alexa, take down the decorations.
I wish it was as simple as that.
I know.
Yeah.
I know.
Yeah, let me look in the mirror and say, all right, Chris, you can take down the decorations. That's my clone. Oh, no, wait a minute. So, my clone quit. Never mind.
So, I live in a standalone house in a decent part of Nashville, and this year the Harnack family we haven't done our Christmas thing yet. My relatives, my side of the family, is all coming over this Saturday as we're having the Harnack holiday hullabaloo. That's what I decided to call it. And so our house is still fully decorated for Christmas. We got stockings on the fireplace and lights all ringing the house and a big lighted wreath on the chimney and all this and lighted deer out in the front. So all that stuff's up. And I'm not looking forward to taking it all down, climbing around on the roof, over on the backside of the roof, literally 30 feet above the ground. I'm not excited about that. What do you do with a New York apartment, Chris? Did you get all decorated out? Or you put up a Charlie Brown tree or what?
Well, I haven't done the Charlie Brown tree in a long time. We did do that one year. It was fun. It's a live tree. It lasts for several weeks. It comes down this weekend, and then we take it out to the street. The New York City Sanitation Department comes by and collects all the trees, and they make mulch out of it, and it goes to the city parks. So yeah.
Oh, okay.
It's pretty straightforward. Yeah.
Good deal. Good deal. Well, let's bring in our guest, Gary Liebisch, and Gary, welcome in. Where are you talking to us from?
I'm talking to you from my home. We're in Columbus, Ohio. We've lived here for about just outside of Columbus in Powell. And this is the office where I conducted my Nautel business for at least the last 7 out of the past 12 years. And just trying to get settled in for retirement here.
Gary, we're going to jump right into some of your tales, including, in fact, we're going to start with your top 10 list in just a minute. But before we take our first commercial break, Gary, what about you? Did you decorate for Christmas, and have you got it all down yet, or did you invoke Alexa to help you?
I feel bad that you guys still have yours up. We have only the tree left. The tree and the electric train set that I put around the tree is still up. We took down the rest of the decorations, but the tree is still up, and my wife and I are going to get at that within the next couple of days. Our objective is usually to leave it up until Little Christmas, the Epiphany on January the 6th. So anytime is fair game after that. But when you have a mild weekend like we had last weekend, that's the time to take down the outside lights.
We would, when I was a kid, we would go from St. Nicholas Day, on December 6th, until Epiphany, around January 6th. So so we tried to talk our parents into a whole month and all that. So yeah. My dad was kind of big on St. Nicholas Day, so we'd persuade him to let us open our one present on St. Nicholas. Yeah,
that's really early. Really?
Yeah, exactly. All right. Hey, our show This Week in Radio Tech is brought to you in part by Angry Audio at angryaudio.com. Let's take a look at the talk show gadget from Angry Audio. Those little audio mixers that you can buy so cheaply? You see them everywhere, and some of them are so good you may be tempted to use one in a radio studio. Well, sadly, they're missing some necessary features that until now have only been available on expensive radio consoles. Enter the Talk Show Gadget. The Talk Show Gadget adds essential broadcast features to your live mixer, like a studio monitor, volume control, and a second input for listening to the air feed. Your monitor speakers will mute automatically to prevent feedback when any mic is live. And speaking of live mics, the Talk Show Gadget even provides logic to illuminate an on-air sign, hopefully hushing those hallway chatter boxes. LED illuminated push buttons instantly activate up to 4 microphones, and you can get the mix right and then just leave the faders in place, controlling everything with the buttons on the Talk Show Gadget. From the powder-coated steel enclosure to the integrated internal linear power supply, the Talk Show Gadget is built rugged for the realities of radio. It looks great on your desk. Talk Show Gadget from Angry Audio. You can turn any mixer into a radio mixer. And where do you get it? Well, you can talk to Broadcasters General Store, proaudio.com, or SCMS about the Talk Show Gadget, or just mention Angry Audio. I want that thing from Angry Audio. Thanks a lot, Angry Audio, for sponsoring This Week in Radio Tech. All right, Gary's with us. Chris Tobin, we've got a treat. And you being a New Yorker, we got a treat that you will extra appreciate because so much of this happened right in your backyard. Gary, it is time. We're going to start out with your top 10 list. So let's see it.
Well, I'll give you a little bit of background to this. Tom Giglio, who was I must honor, had brought humor for the first time to Radio World about back in the 70s. Actually, he used to do a column called "Where's the Engineer?" And he would talk about how he would go into McDonald's and set his pager off in order to get them to flip the French fries. And I always thought it was a very amusing column. And a number of years later, I got an inspiration during the Dave Letterman Top 10 era, because the NIST, which runs time station WWV, was asking for suggestions on how to improve the WWV time service. And in a fit of inspiration, I came up with my own top 10 on how the NIST could improve the WWV time service. So here we go with number 10. Buy the rights to DOOP from the old Mutual Network. Remember that?
I do.
Yeah. Number 9. A new station ID identifying with the larger market. WWV Fort Collins, Denver.
I can hear it now. WWV Fort Collins, Denver. Yes,
right?
Exactly. The larger market.
Number 8. Let's see. Get number 8. I don't want to get ahead of myself. Number 8. New slogan. Give us 22 minutes. We'll give you 22 minutes.
Chris, that hits close to home, doesn't it?
That it does.
Number 7. You remember Perfect Paul on the National Weather Service? The Perfect Paul
yes.
voice?
Yeah, the drunken
Hire
Swede.
Perfect Paul away from the National Weather Service to do a side-splitting morning show. You know. Number 6. Have music director expand the playlist to include the theme from 60 Minutes. How did that go? Tick, 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 tick.
Yeah, that's right. Tick, tick, tick. That's right.
Number 5 on the list of ways to improve WWV. Do a station promo poking fun at the Canadians on CHU.
Okay. Oh.
Number 4, new drive time slogan, propagation and solar weather together on the 15th.
Oh, traffic and weather together on the 8th. Yeah, yeah.
And this would involve some broadcast equipment. A live solar flare remote from the surface of the sun.
Oh, gosh.
That would melt a brick, you know.
Yeah, exactly.
Number 2, hire a low-paid intern sidekick for the announcer who laughs hysterically every time he gives the time.
Have a giggle chick for the.
Always had to have a sidekick. Just laughed hysterically. Everything.
Yeah.
Back then, you know.
Oh man.
And the number 1 promotional idea for WWV: 9th caller wins an atomic clock.
Oh gosh.
Now, you know, that was published in Radio World, but it was published, sadly, the week of 9/11, and we all had more serious things on our mind back then, and and it got published then, and I've shared it, years later with some folks and done it at SPE meetings and so forth. But since we're kind of doing a retrospective here, I thought I would kind of throw that in.
Oh my goodness!
And now they're talking about discontinuing the WWV service.
I heard that.
Was news lately.
What do you know about that proposal?
To save money, I think it's a Trump administration proposal so I don't think they would discontinue the service of 60 kilohertz,
right?
Which is the service that synchronizes all of our clocks. But I guess they perhaps think that there is not much justification for a voice, audio time check anymore, because everything is kind of set by internet clock standards now. But who knows? I haven't heard much more about it. It was talked about a while back.
Yeah. So you're talking about that 60 kilohertz signal that you mentioned. That's what? Well, I've got one here on my wall. In fact, it says it's receiving it right now. One of those cheap atomic reference clocks.
Right.
I think the one I'm looking at. Yeah, the one I'm looking at may have been $29 at Costco or Walmart. And it a few times a day it kind of picks up a signal.
Yeah, it doesn't pick it up continuously, but it doesn't need it continuously. Usually, just a couple times a day is enough to keep it in sync. I've got one here on my weather station as well.
Yeah. Yep. Wow. Chris, do those clocks work in New York City, or is there too much radio noise there?
I've seen some work well, and others, there's too much noise. That's not that easy. But
wow.
You find ways.
Gary, does that 60 kilohertz signal come out of Fort Collins at the main WWV site?
Gee, I'm not sure. I'm not certain whether it does.
Tom Ray, former co-host on this show, you made a trip there and got to visit.
In fact, I have the same picture of me standing at the front door that he has of him standing in front of it. Mine was taken 40-something years ago, about 1972. But I have the same picture. I used to joke that I would joke that I once got a job there and I was the music director. And never mind.
Well, I remember this has been jokes about WWV have been going around the radio biz certainly for years. One of I remember a friend of mine, a program director at one of the first stations that I engineered for when I was in business for myself, KWLN. It hit Memphis with a rock and roll. Anyway, Brad Young, who now works at Wide Orbit. Brad would imitate the guy doing the time announcements. He'd hold the phone up like this and he'd say, yeah, babe, yeah. Oh, hey, hang on a second, babe. I got to do a break. At the tone, 13 hours, 23 minutes, coordinated universal time. Hey, babe, where were we? Gosh. All right. So here's the good news for this show. We've got a combination of hilarious stuff from Gary and some serious advice too. I'll preview the serious advice. One of the things we're going to be talking about is enclosures for broadcast gear when you don't have a full building. And I've seen this done badly a lot and had to fix things that were done badly a lot. But Gary, give us a little bit of hope. You're going to have some good ideas that equipment can actually last in and run well in?
Sure. Yeah. I guess, what we talked about earlier was maybe delving into the liquid cooling topic first.
That too. Yeah.
As long as we're talking about cooling, since that seems to be quite a bit of topic of discussion these days on, whether liquid cooling is the new on the horizon way to design transmitters. I had done a paper back at the NAB for 2012 on the pros and cons of liquid cooling. At that time, nobody, at least domestically in the U.S., was doing any liquid cooling. There are now two manufacturers that sell in the U.S. that are doing liquid cooling now. But back in 2012, everybody was dreaming about it and wondering whether or not it's a practical thing to do. Europe has been way ahead of the U.S. with respect to liquid cooling for a couple of reasons. Number one, they have less physical space to put transmitters in, and number two, the electric rates in Europe are considerably higher, and as a result, the ROI becomes a bigger factor in justifying the move to liquid cooling on a particular site. So, it was not really new technology. It was the concept was new to the U.S. with respect to radio, and not even new to the U.S. with respect to broadcasting in general, because television at UHF, where transmitters have been notoriously inefficient, had been using liquid cooling for decades. So it was not a new technology, but folks were talking about it, and that was the reason that I, as part of Nautel, did a paper back in 2012 for the NAB regarding the pros and cons of liquid cooling. But and since then, what's happened is that the air-cooled transmitters have become more efficient by a factor of about 10%, by virtue of the fact that LD-MOS, a newer type of chip that's more efficient, has become in widespread use. And so with air-cooled transmitters getting more efficient, there was perhaps less motivation to want to move to liquid cooling, but there are still some situations where liquid cooling makes a lot of sense. A number of things have to conspire to be in your favor or disfavor, as the case may be, in order to justify using liquid cooling. First of all, we have found that certainly in certain climates in the U.S., talking about basically along the Gulf Coast, the desert Southwest, even in high elevations where air tends to be thin, air tends to be scarce with respect to cooling. The climate kind of lends itself to an alternate cooling form. So that's one of the factors that comes into play in the decision on whether or not liquid cooling can work for you. The other another factor is the cost per kilowatt hour. Power bills are notoriously difficult to try and read and figure out what your kilowatt hour rate is. They're very convoluted. You pay for delivery charges and you pay some fixed price things, but for the most part, you can divide your total bill by the number of kilowatt hours you used and pretty much get in the ballpark. Surprisingly, power rates have remained fairly stable over the decades. A lot of times people use, when they don't know what their actual power rate is, they might use 10 cents a kilowatt hour as just a number to pull out of the air. And that hasn't been too far off for a long time. Like a decade or more, people have been using that number. And there are still a lot of places in the U.S. where you pay less than that. There are places in the U.S. where you pay significantly more than that. Particularly, I'm speaking of the Northeast, where you can pay upwards of 16 or 17 cents per kilowatt hour. So, where the kilowatt hour rates are high, that is the second factor that would contribute to somebody wanting to consider a liquid cooled transmitter. Of course, the Northeast is not where the weather and the climate would necessarily favor it, but that's another consideration. A third consideration is new construction, where you would be otherwise looking at the possibility of installing large amounts of air conditioning. We typically hear in high power FM installations where the transmitter alone might require 8 tons of cooling, that people are installing, upwards of 15 or 20 tons of air conditioning. And if you can save 5 tons on that, then 5 or 6 tons on that, then that's a significant amount. So certainly if you're doing new construction and you don't plan on air cooling the transmitter, you can build accordingly, and there can be some savings there. That kind of goes away as an advantage if you have existing infrastructure that already has cooling installed. Now, certainly there's savings with respect to the power consumption, but it takes a bit longer to get that back than it does on the initial cost and the installation cost. So that's the third factor. And finally, the fourth factor is the type of liquid cooling that the transmitter uses. Now, of the two companies that are selling high power FM liquid cooled transmitters in the U.S. right now, one of them uses a hybrid design and one uses a fully liquid cooled design. So the Gates Air version, I say, is hybrid because the power supplies are not liquid cooled, but the power amplifiers are. And in the Rode & Schwartz version, it's entirely liquid cooled. So the design that the manufacturer uses is going to affect the ROI and the efficiency, the cooling efficiency of the transmitter. So power supplies, I think I once calculated, are about 30% of the total cooling cost. So you've got about 70% of the cooling cost is in cooling the power amplifiers, and about 30% is in cooling the power supplies. So that give you an idea of the relative contribution of liquid cooling, in a hybrid versus a fully liquid cooled transmitter. So as a result of all of those factors taken into account, in some cases, the more of those factors that you have going for you, the better case that you could make. And of course, management always wants to hear about the ROI. So the pitfall is that in some of the presentations that I have heard, in order to make these numbers work, they're using cost per kilowatt hour rates that are way above what a customer might actually be paying. Because and when I used to do power consumption costs for customers, there were very frequently kilowatt hour rates in parts of the U.S. that are down below 10 cents a kilowatt hour. Typically, maybe 7 or 8 cents a kilowatt hour is not uncommon in some places. So that makes it a little bit harder to justify, even though you might be in a warm climate, because the return on it is going to be considerably slower. So those are kind of the factors that folks take into account. So kind of the bottom line is that there is no best. There is no air cooling is not best. Liquid cooling is not best or better. It all comes down to how many of those factors play into your particular installation. And then you really have to work the numbers yourself, and you have to use your own numbers, not necessarily the numbers that you saw on a sales presentation. And in some cases, the conclusion will be that the ROI on a liquid cooled transmitter will be pretty good. Depends on what period of time you're looking for the ROI, for what period of time you're looking to get the payback. But sometimes it pays off, and sometimes it's a very long and extended payback.
Do you know if there's any kind of online calculator, or might an engineer need to make his own spreadsheet to consider different scenarios? So I'm sure if you talk to a transmitter company that offers liquid cooled transmitters, their presentation is going to bias that way. Like, for example, having the higher electricity rates, or maybe underestimating their own maintenance costs and overestimating others' maintenance costs. Whereas a air-cooled transmitter company may do exactly the opposite. How would an engineer look at this in a balanced fashion?
Well, you can use a template that you might get from a manufacturer, but you do have to be careful about and make sure you use your own numbers, because a lot of the so-called sales pitches will work in the cost of construction and the air conditioning that you don't have to buy. But if you're in an infrastructure that already has that cooling system there, that's not a return that you can depend on, because the infrastructure is already there. So you really have to run your own numbers and do your own spreadsheets, because the size of buildings is so vastly different and have to be customized. And so if you're cooling an entire building, remember when we used to say that a Nautel GV40 took about 8 tons of air conditioning when it was operating in HD mode at full rated power. But that was only the tons of cooling in BTUs that it required to exchange the air in the transmitter. It didn't include the cooling required to cool the space that the transmitter is living in, which I can never estimate for a customer, and neither can any spreadsheet you get from a manufacturer, because the size of buildings is different. The amount of insulation in those buildings is different. You really have to go to, excuse me, your HVAC contractor and ask him, how much cooling does this building take if it were empty? If there was no transmitter in here and somebody gave you an empty building here, what would it cost to cool it? And what I used to tell customers is, get that number from the HVAC contractor and then add in the 8 tons that we give you for a 40 kilowatt transmitter, and that way you'll arrive at your number. So I would say everybody has to use their own numbers in arriving at whether or not there is a justified return in those situations.
Gary, I would have thought, and I'm not that familiar with high power UHF television transmitters, the ones that used vapor phase cooling or liquid cooling. But in that case, you were just cooling the klystron too, right? You weren't cooling lots of other things in the transmitter, right? Just the klystron.
That's correct, but that was a major item in the components of the transmitter.
Right. Similarly, we've had Don Backus on with Roden Schwartz, and he described that a huge amount of the heat of a Roden Schwartz FM transmitter is carried away because the power supplies and the amplifiers are both liquid cooled, and so there's not a lot of other heat that doesn't get taken away by the liquid. And then with the Harris transmitter, as you mentioned, it's a hybrid, so the major part of the heat is taken away from the power amplifiers, but the power supplies themselves are still air cooled, so their heat stays in the building until you evacuate it somehow or cool the building. What I was wondering though is, I think it's kind of interesting, because I saw a Harris transmitter up close. Charles Kinney in Atlanta demonstrated one of his fairly new Harris transmitter, where let's say Harris, Gates Air, where he could pull out a power module, and the water, the liquid connections would close up before you pulled the thing all the way out. And I wonder, so with the klystron, you probably had just a couple of connections, a gazenta and a gazouta, right? And you weren't pulling the klystron hot, right? You would turn everything off, and then you'd unhook all the liquid. But the fact that now we have and I don't know how long they've been around, so that's kind of what I'm getting at. How long have we had these instant disconnects where it made possible servicing a liquid cooled transmitter while it was on the air?
It is black magic in the way that is done, and those quick disconnects. And there's a name for them which escapes me at the moment, but they've been around for the recent past. But you're right that it was it was not practical in a klystron to do that, because you don't hot plug a klystron tube.
Yeah.
So it really was not a relevant feature at that point in time.
Well, what I'm wondering is and hey, Chris, you may have some insight, because you got a facility where you're familiar with, Chris, that's all liquid cooled. There's lots of TV transmitters there, and there could be FMs there at some point in the future. But we had air-cooled solid-state FM transmitters for some years, and of course, Nautel makes exactly that. But it wouldn't be practical to implement such a solid state transmitter unless we also had the people wouldn't want to give away their hot swappability, right? I guess you've got to have this instant liquid shutoff where you can pull a module out and the liquid doesn't just spray everywhere. You've got to have that before you can have a liquid cooled FM transmitter, I would think.
Well,
yes. I would think.
Yeah. Well, it's also a safety reason. I know I talked to folks years ago, a couple of TV sites when, the klystrons were still around, and, keeping them cool, the liquid cooling of that process. There were a lot of safety issues when it came to the liquid cooling process and how the hoses were done and what type of hose material you used, the connectors, how they were properly maintained. So moving forward, as Gary mentioned, today with the quick disconnect, I'm thinking it's probably a combination of, yes, it's ease of use and it's convenient, but it's more for a safety part so that you can do what you want. And because you're doing the solid state, it's slightly different now. It's a little easier to work with.
Gary, if you would, just review for me one little factor that I haven't quite caught on to yet, and that is that you kind of implied that liquid-cooled FM transmitters, there's more benefit to them when the electric rates are high. What is it about the electric rate or the amount of electricity required for air cooling a given heat load versus liquid cooling that same heat load? Well, I'm not seeing why there's a big difference in that if there's a high rate of electricity.
Well, there's a higher amount of electricity being used to run air conditioning than there is to run pumps and heat exchangers, which are on the liquid cooled transmitters. So, obviously, if the electric rate is higher, then the gap between those two operating costs become greater, and that's your ROI. Between the costs of operating pumps versus operating, air conditioning compressors.
That makes sense.
I should also add that one of the other things that was brought out in my paper that I did several years ago was the fact that when you take on liquid cooling, you've got to learn some plumbing. You got to learn some plumbing skills, and I think in an organization such as Cox, you mentioned Charles Kinney earlier, they have a staff of very good engineers at just about all of their stations that can take the time to learn, some of the new, at least new to them, technology that comes with the liquid cooling. But imagine yourself in a situation where you have a contract engineer in a small market, and he's maintaining, a dozen or 2 dozen radio stations, and one of them suddenly becomes liquid cooled. Does he have the skills or the time? Does he have the toolbox to maintain that liquid cooled transmitter? Does he have the ability to learn what needs to be learned in order to maintain that transmitter when he only sees it perhaps when they have a problem, maybe once a month, once every several months? And so there's that skill set is easier to acquire in the corporate broadcast world than it is in the contract engineering world.
Understood. That makes sense. Sure enough. Hey, friends, you are watching or listening to This Week in Radio Tech, episode 427 with Gary Liebisch. I'm Kirk Harnack, along with Chris Tobin, and Gary's been giving us the rundown on some of the differences between air-cooled and liquid-cooled transmitters. Coming up, as the show continues, Gary, right after this break, Gary's got a funny story for us, a couple of funny stories, I think, about some remote control issues and maybe something else. So just hang on for that. And also, one more thing we're going to learn from Gary Liebisch is about shelters for, not full-size buildings, but just tiny shelters for broadcast gear and how to do that right, because I certainly have seen it done wrong. I'm interested in hearing about how to get it done right. Our show This Week in Radio Tech is brought to you in part by our friends at Lavo, at lavo.com/TWiRT. Yes, they've got a special landing page just for us radio engineers. So check that out. We're going to hear from Lavo. We'll be right back. Hang on.
There has probably never been a better time in history to buy a new radio mixing console. Today's consoles are more sophisticated than ever, with more features and functions than you can shake a stick at. But have you noticed how complicated they are? There's a sea of knobs and switches and displays and buttons. Some of them look like you might need a pilot's license to do your show. Well, a board doesn't have to be complicated to be powerful. Just look at the new Ruby mixing surface from Lavo. The first thing you notice is how smooth and streamlined it is. Ruby has lots of cool tech, but what it doesn't have is that confusing ocean of buttons that clutter things up. Now, we all know that there are some console features the jock only uses once in a while, so why dedicate controls to them? Ruby fixes this problem by moving those once-in-a-blue-moon controls to a touch-sensitive, customizable GUI that happily shares screen space with your other studio software, helping you fight control room clutter. Thanks to this design innovation, talent that use Ruby produce smoother shows with less errors. Controls that are used the most fall naturally to hand, while functions that rarely need adjustment are easily controlled with just a couple of clicks in the context-sensitive GUI. And Ruby has cool features you won't find on other boards, like Auto Mix, an intelligent gain writing function that guarantees the perfect mix for multi-mic morning shows and call-in segments. Dual mode snapshots that instantly switch the motorized faders between on-air and production modes, and enough DSP and I/O options to make even your pro sound pals green with envy. And because quality is as important to Lavo as it is to you, every console is proudly built to fanatically precise standards at Lavo's own factory in Germany. If you're ready to declutter your control room, do yourself a favor. Check out the new Ruby and the other cool Lavo radio tech at www.lawo.com/TWiRT.
There you go. That's the URL to go to, and that will take you, first of all, to their radio-centric gear, because Lavo does a lot of other stuff, too. And plus, it'll let them know that we sent you. So thanks a lot to Lavo for sponsoring This Week in Radio Tech. Hey, it's Kirk Harnack. Chris Tobin is here. He's in the performance studio. We're going to ask him to sing our outro song as we get ready to leave later on today. Gary Liebisch is our guest today. Gary had been with Nautel for years, but he'd also done plenty of broadcast engineering. And Gary, you were on the air too. I saw an old picture of you behind the mic. Is that right?
Yeah, I did that for maybe about, well, from the time I started in college radio until I got out of college, and for about maybe 5 years after that, I suppose. I found myself at a radio station at one point where they had no engineer and somebody needed to build a production room. And I had a ham radio background, so I knew something about electronics. I did have a first-class license. And so I just jumped in and decided to help build the production room that they needed. And I decided after that the next station I go to, I want to be just a chief engineer. And that's kind of how the engineering part of it started.
So as long as we're talking about jocks and being on the air, tell us about this jock who was off the air. That's one of your tales from the trench. What about that?
I've told a lot of these stories at SBE meetings, so some people may have heard them, but they're always fun to hear. So, weekend jocks are typically, the least experienced, of course, and sometimes they can get very easily flustered by things that happen. So let me set the stage. I was at WSPA in Spartanburg, South Carolina, which was on 950. And there was another station in town, which was the top 40 station that was on 910. So they were, very close together on the dial. And we had a TFT modulation monitor in the control room that was very, very wide band. In other words, if our carrier was not there, there was enough splatter from the other station that you could get some monkey chatter in the monitor. Mm. So the operator calls up and says, "I think we're almost off the air." Okay, not we're off the air. We're almost off the air. Awesome. And so I said, "What do you mean almost off the air?" And I think she said, "Well, listening in my monitor, I can hear something going." And I said, "Okay, I want you to go to the remote control and hit 2 rays. Most of us who have been around a number of years always remembered that channel 2 on the remote control, of course, brought the filaments on and 2 brought the plates on. So I said, go to the remote control and hit 2 rays. So she dutifully does that. And so what I hear in the background is in complete silence. Okay. So she hits 2 rays. And then she said, uh-oh, that did it. I said, what happened? She says, now we're really off the air. I said, just hit a button on the console and you'll be good.
Chris Tobin, I got to tell you, this is one of my biggest problems too. And Gary, maybe you got to, at our radio stations, whether it's in Mississippi or Hawaii or American Samoa, getting non-engineers to understand the difference between transmitter off and no audio, but transmitter on is the biggest challenge we have.
Yeah.
Chris, what do you do in New York? Well, you don't go off the air in New York, do you? Ever?
Well, not intentionally. No, we have our moments. What I do,
air monitors anymore.
That's true. That's true. No, what I've done in the last 10 years now, but what I do now is I have all types of little boxes that monitor all the different stages of the audio chain, RF chain, and as soon as there's a disruption somewhere along that path, I get an email, text. Several people do, and that's how I know whether we're on the air with carrier and no audio, or off the air with no carrier, but people are still playing audio because they're not monitoring off the air. So that's how I keep track of it. I do not expect announcers, presenters, DJs to understand the concepts and why they need to worry about these things, since they don't do it every day. It's friends of mine who work in public safety who tell me that the reason they have to train on a regular basis, because if you're not doing certain things every day on a regular basis, you forget. And I've never expected disc jockeys or presenters and announcers to know this stuff. And as Gary had a great story with now you did it, we're off the air. I could tell you one where it was a classic. I'll never forget it. I worked at an AM FM station. And oddly enough, the AM operator seemed to understood more about what to do with the transmitter outage than the FM did. And back then, 20 years ago, you always expected AM FM combo. The AM guys never paid attention. Nobody cared. And I get a morning call, Sunday morning call, and it's from the AM operator. And I said, "Oh, what's up?" He goes, "Oh, I just want to let you know we had an outage. There was a power problem, but I followed the instructions and transmitter's back on the air. The readings are what they should be in the book, and we're good." I said, "Okay. Could you look down the hall and see how the FM person is doing?" And he goes, "Well, they look like they're doing their show. Lights going on. They're doing their stuff. I don't know. I guess it's okay." Okay, it's good to hear. I don't get a call from the FM folks. I'm like, Then I get a phone call from my transmitter remote control. And those of you who had the original early Burke units, remember the lady's voice if you chose that one, or the male voice, and the ESI unit, the speech unit. And of course, it's telling me there's an alarm condition and there's a problem at the transmitter. I call the studio hotline. I try to remote in, and I can't seem to get it to work. The remote, there must have been a real good power hiccup. I call the studio. I tell the person, "Hey, you're off the air." "Oh, no, we're not. We're on the air." Of course, they're monitoring a program, not the air button. Even though there's a strobe light flashing behind them telling them there's a problem. That's okay. It's just there for looks. So I said, "Hey, did you not get a call from the transmitter remote control saying there's a problem?" He goes, No, but the hotline kept ringing for a while. Some lady kept calling and giving me the call letters of the radio station. Right. That's correct. And do you remember there's a piece of paper, a red piece of paper with large black lettering to the left of the CRT, which has the remote control readings? He goes, yeah. What's line number 1 say? "Oh, remote control will call if there's a problem. It'll be a female voice. The voice will be as follows." "Oh, is that what she was trying to tell me?" Yes, she was trying to tell me the transmitter was off. I was like, okay, we got everything back to normal, and we're operating. And I just sat there at the house going, okay, how does this work? I'm trying to figure out the part-timer who puts in 8 hours a week at the 20 kilowatt AM station, directional daytime only, calls up and says, "I took care of the problem," where the full-time FM operator just had no clue. Because they were running a contest. It was very important the contest gets done, so they didn't have time for this harassment they were getting from the remote control. So to add insult to injury to this whole incident, which I just brushed off, I was like, all right, I get it. They're not supposed to know. I have to come up with another plan, which I did. Months later, this person moved on in the industry and they went on to do other things like voice acting and whatnot, voiceover work. I'm sitting in a Sony theater one night watching a movie, the trailers coming on and everything, and all of a sudden I hear this voice talking about the next movie coming up, and please will you turn off your this, turn off that, no talking during this. And it is the person who couldn't figure out that the remote control was calling them had now landed a job as the voice of the Sony theaters across America.
Oh, wow. Well,
I sat there going, I know that person, and friends of mine are like, ooh. I said, no, I know who that is. I know exactly. I'm like, wow, I've got to change careers. Since that point in time, I decided I do not hold announcers or even newscasters at a place I worked at, or sportscasters, expect them to know this stuff. I just don't expect it. It's not a bad thing. It's just I get it. They don't do it every day. Why would they remember it?
I have a couple of other. While you're on the remote control bandwagon here, I have a couple of other remote control funny stories, and one of them involves the Burke as well. But before they had the Burke, Mosley had the MRC1 and the MRC2. They'd only sold the MRC1 for a very short period of time. The MRC1 had status lights on the front panel, and I thought it was so cool to finally have a remote control that had status lights. It was a new thing back then, because it used to be that all you could get was meter readings. And so I would dream up things that I could put on the status lights. And I had a couple of blanks left, and I didn't know what to do. So one of them I labeled bad announcer alarm. So I went out to the transmitter one day while the program director was doing afternoon drive, who had a really good sense of humor. And of course, I manually triggered that closure a couple of times. And I would trigger it and then leave it alone and then go back and trigger it again. And then my pager goes off. And so I called the hotline into the studio and I said, Mike, what's going on? He says, I got this alarm on the remote control. It keeps coming on. I said, what does it say? He said, it says bad announcer alarm. I said, Mike, it sounds like the problem is at your end. He burst out laughing. Then there was another thing that I did on fun things you could get the Burke ESI to say. The ESI was a speech interface. And they gave you a very limited vocabulary. I think there were like 300 different things that it could say. And I think it could say 4 words. You could say the entire alphabet and then a number of other words. And I came up with a bunch of very creative things that you could make the Burke remote control say. For example, if you have the system call the GM's hotline, it could say, please fire PD. All right, so you could give a message like that. You could have PDIQ is below lower limit. You could have, this one would make you panic. You could say transmitter is underwater. I mean, those are all used just creatively using the words that were in the remote control system. So that was another fun thing that we did.
Wow. That's I did some work, several years of work for Sam Phillips, the guy who discovered Elvis and owned Phillips Recording and Sun Records. And Sam had some stations in Alabama, and he would drive from Memphis to the stations once in a while, and the jocks all said, "Is there any way we can know when he's on his way? So we can, I don't know, answer the phone correctly or play what we're supposed to play on the air," whatever it was. Obviously, they weren't behaving correctly when he wasn't there. And I said, I'm see this meter right here. I'm going to repurpose this. Some old meter. I was on some old piece of equipment. I said, this will be a Sam Phillips proximity detector. And when he gets within 30 miles, it'll start moving up. When it reaches the red, he's just around the corner. So, yeah.
And one more remote control story. Yeah. There's so many of these remote control stories that can turn out funny. And Tom Taylor published this for me in his what is that thing he used to have in his column at the end about it really happened, or I can't remember the Daily Tom Taylor thing, but you can't make this up, I think is what it was called.
Yeah,
you can't make this up. He would have it in the newsletter, and I submitted one to him about a year ago, which was a true story, because I was in Raleigh and I was checking the logs one Monday morning, and again, the victim of this one is another weekender, and we used two 20 kilowatt 20K Harrises to make 38 kilowatts. They were combined transmitters to make 38, which was pretty common back then. So when they took meter readings, they had to take readings on two transmitters. They had to put the total power, and then they had to put the power of each one. So I'm reviewing the logs, as we were dutifully required to do, to check the logs on a Monday morning. And I noticed that it says raised power on transmitter B due to listener complaints. And I was trying to figure out what that meant. So I went to him and I asked him, what does this mean, raised power on transmitter B due to listener complaints? And the jock said, yeah, I got a call that the right channel was low. And so I decided to raise the power on right channel, transmitter B.
Oh, God.
True story. True story. Yeah.
I'll tell you what, let's cover that serious topic for a minute about enclosures. So we have more and more LPFM and translator stations where you may not have access to, you may not have the money or the finances to build an actual building for your gear to go into. You may not need that. In fact, in American Samoa, we've got a tower site right next to our building, and there's plenty of translator gear in makeshift. They're not very pretty makeshift enclosures. So Gary, how should we do that right?
Well, this was going to be my tip. That was what you.
Well, then I'm sorry. Let's hold it then.
Okay.
I apologize. You're right. That was going to be the tip. Tell you what, then. Okay. You had one more. You had a couple more little funny things that you wanted to pass along. Why don't you give us one more quick tale from the trench?
One of them was just a time that I had, and probably a lot of guys have had this happen. When you go to I used to do my transmitter maintenance on Sunday night at after 11 o'clock, and I would stay till 2 or 3 in the morning, because you'd run the backup transmitter, and you could run the generator, and if you were at low power and nobody cared, then it got to be after midnight and so forth. So I would routinely make a trip to the transmitter site around 11 o'clock every Sunday night. And one time I went out to the transmitter site, and there's maybe a 0.2 of a mile driveway into the site before you get to the gate. And I got to the gate, and there was a car parked there. And the car was, do I need to say more than the fact that the car was occupied? All right.
but probably not ready to drive off at a moment's notice.
Not in the driver's seat either. Okay.
No. God.
And so, I flashed my lights a few times, and there was some activity there. And finally the guy got out, and he walked back to me, and he said, can you give me about 5 minutes? And I said, no, I got to get in here. I was mean. I was cruel. I said, no, I'm sorry. I got to get in here. He said, oh, all right. So I ruined his evening. I ruined his night. He had to get out there, get out of the way.
What was he going to do in 5 minutes? That was going to make everything okay. I
don't know.
Rather not know. Chris, you've run across that, haven't you? A car parked where you need to go?
Oh, yeah. I've had a few of those. Unfortunately, they were not involving that particular item. If that's the case, they were more nefarious. Yeah. One place. Well, I had a transmitter site that was in a part of town that was pretty much, let's just put it this way. When I would drive down to the site, the local police would drive up alongside me and say, "Excuse me, sir, are you lost?" I'm like, no, I work at the building down there. Oh, yeah, we'll ride behind you. Just follow us, or you follow. I'm like, oh, okay, yeah. And then it was also the time at the transmitter site, as Gary pointed out, I would go out to my sites by every 2 weeks and check on things. And never forget the one night I was at the site checking on things, working the transmitters, dummy loads, the whole bit, tower lights, and measuring stuff, and just having some fun experimenting. Because at that hour, 11 o'clock to 3 in the morning, really nobody was paying attention. That would concern yourself. All of a sudden, I heard these big, loud popping sounds. I'm like, what the heck is that? I'm thinking it's thunder. And I go outside, and there's total darkness. and I noticed the lights along the street are out, which is not a good sign. I'm like, Then all of a sudden the lights in the transmitter building went out and generator came on, so I wasn't panicking there. Turns out somebody was being chased by police, drove into a power pole about half a block down and hit the one pole that apparently was maintaining the proper balance and tension along the wires of 12 other poles along that street. Out it went. And the cops came into my building and want to know who I was, what am I doing here, and how long was that car outside my building. I'm like, what are you talking about? It turns out that the person was hanging out on our property, went through the fence, the back end of the property, and drive onto the street through the backside. Because we had about, I think, an acre of land with the AM towers. I was like, oh, I came through the front gate, which was locked. So he must have came through the back gate and went back out that way. Yeah, it was a fun time. Today, I don't hear many stories like this anymore because a lot of sites are no longer out in the the middle of nowhere. If you had an AM site, you're on several acres of land. You probably had control of it. It was in a place very rural. Nobody really bothered. Nowadays, most of these sites are gone.
Gone, or suburbs are grown up around them, so that they're no longer out in the middle of nowhere.
And there's nothing. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's. But some of these stories, and to Gary's point, it's just these are things that you look at. It's just part of the job. I mean, I used to tell these stories to folks like, "This is what you do." I was like, "Well, it's just part of the job. It's just how it's you learn how to deal with it. You understand that whenever you go to your transmitter site at 11 o'clock at night, depending on what the site's location is, you are prepared."
We'll do another whole show sometime on the things you run into at transmitter sites, from cows to naked people to whatever it may be. Hey, we're doing This Week in Radio Tech. Kirk Harnack, Chris Tobin, and Gary Liebisch is our guest. We're going to have tips coming up. That's when sorry to get ahead of myself. That's when Gary's going to have the tip about how to properly enclose low power FM or translator gear, or whatever you need to, and you don't have the option of having a building. So I'm going to be interested in that. Our show This Week in Radio Tech is brought to you in part by Broadcasters General Store and the ProMix 4 you get it from Broadcast General Store. Let's have a look at the website here. It's from Broadcast Tools. That's what I was trying to think of. Broadcast Tools and the ProMix 4. It's a compact yet full-featured mono audio mixing console. So you don't have to worry about left and right channel. This is for going out and doing mono remotes, like sports broadcasts, like the parade, like the car dealership broadcast. You don't need to worry about left and right stereo stuff and have the extra wiring, or just use this. It's got exactly what you need. It features 3 combination mic line inputs and a dedicated 4th input that can be switched between a balanced line input or the built-in USB audio interface. So play audio from your computer. Do interviews, or have it play. Have a soundboard and do your sound effects that way, or your intros, your outros, even commercials. You could play them back that way. It has 3 quarter-inch, not the little tiny ones, but the quarter-inch good stereo headphone outputs. They're included with individual controls for volume, mix, and pan, allowing custom headphone mixes. And, you can get that more me mix or more of the return mix. Other features include switch selectable program limiter, XLR program output, monitor output with muting and volume control. So if you do have a speaker situation, you can put this in a studio if you need to. It'll mute those speakers for you. Mix minus output for connection to an external telephone hybrid, and an on-air light relay output. It's a great choice for remote broadcasts, for podcasters. Oh yeah. And if you're going out to those remotes, or even just a studio, you got a quick voice studio, you need to put a console in, do some quick interviews, have a little studio for the news people to interview the mayor, the police chief, whatever newsmaker needs to come by and do a quick interview. This is the perfect little console to do it. Broadcast Tools, ProMix 4. You can get yours at Broadcasters General Store. Now, I love these folks. Been buying things from Broadcaster General Store since the Sam Phillips days. When I used to work with Sam back in the early 1990s, we were building radio stations together. They're great folks. bgs.cc is the website. So if web is your way to do things, great, do that. Or give them a call. They're really nice folks. In fact, I just talked with Dave Kirsten today. He's out on the road, seeing customers, helping people out. Give him a call at 352-622-7700. That's 352-622-7700. Broadcasters General Store, BGS. They're in Ocala, Florida. Hey, I know some of you occasionally take a vacation to Florida, you're driving down to Orlando, you're driving down to the Space Coast or driving to Miami, stop in and see them in Ocala. They'll be glad to see you. At least I hope they will. They're usually glad to see me. Thanks, BGS, for sponsoring This Week in Radio Tech, and thanks a lot to Broadcast Tools and the ProMix 4. All right, in our time remaining, which ain't much, Gary, you've got a tip about what I want to know about equipment enclosures.
Well, yeah, transmitters, particularly the low power ones, have gotten a lot smaller in recent years, particularly in the last 10 years. And a lot of customers like that because they have less space in their transmitter sites. They like the compactness of them. And they've gotten certainly a lot less expensive as well. The price that we all pay for that, though, is the fact that these smaller transmitters need to breathe. And they don't have as much room to breathe as the traditional large transmitters. A large volume inside the cabinet is a good friend to all of the components in that transmitter, because then the heat can dissipate itself through a larger amount of air when the cabinet is significantly large, like the old days when tubes had to dissipate inside cabinets and so forth. But in the smaller transmitters, in order to make up for volume, you have to run a lot of air through them. So you're going to have more fans that run faster, and the CFM, the cubic feet per minute running through a smaller transmitter, is going to be more significant. And then if you take that enclosure and you put it in the enclosure that it's going to be mounted in, and I'm talking about taking the chassis of the transmitter and then putting it in whatever enclosure it's going to be in. Yeah. Instead of putting it in a room, which you would do with a full cabinet transmitter. Well, then again, you're talking about a very low volume space. And if you try to use cooling in that enclosure, and the cooling is going to cycle on and off unless you mix it with the outside air. And if the cooling fails, if you're totally dependent on the cooling in that enclosure, and that cooling fails without any backup, that transmitter will cook very quickly because it will heat the little air that it has outside the chassis in the enclosure will heat up very quickly, and probably very quickly it'll cook the transmitter. So the lesson from all of this is that you have to have a lot of air moving through any enclosure that houses one of these small transmitters. Sometimes the manufacturers of the smaller transmitters have to actually rate them. Traditionally, transmitters were rated at 50 degrees C, which is 122 degrees Fahrenheit. But very often in the smaller transmitters and smaller equipment, they have to be rated less than that. You might see them rated at 40 degrees C, and you have to pay attention to that. 40 degrees C is going to be maybe 111, 112 degrees Fahrenheit. It's very easy to get there on a hot day when something fails in the enclosure. So it's very important to probably my suggestion would be not to necessarily rely on cooling that small enclosure, but to just make sure a lot of air passes through there. Now, I'll give a plug to my good friend Tom King at Kintronic Labs, because they have an enclosure that a couple of our customers have used, which mixes outside air with some cooling, and it's a well-engineered solution for keeping them cool. The other challenge, of course, is that if you're sucking air in from outside and the humidity of that air is very high, or you have blowing wind, blowing rain, then you might get moisture inside that cabinet. So there again, you have to be conscious of the fact that you have to keep moisture out of there. There's no getting away from the fact that these outdoor enclosures are a very, very poor environment for any transmitter to operate in terms of extending its life. And so the key that I would say would be to just move as much air as you can through there, and also that the design of the venting of that cabinet must be such that it's not going to allow blowing rain to blow in there as well and get moisture inside the cabinet. So it's not an easy thing to do. It's a challenging thing to do. Sometimes it's the only solution. If at all possible, I'd always recommend trying to get a transmitter inside of some type of a building. But it can be done it can't be done indiscriminately. It does require a lot of attention to detail and design.
Okay, understood. Chris, do you have anything to add to that tip about enclosures?
No, that's pretty much it. I mean, you definitely need to know the space and the temperature and the rise and the outside environment. If you're doing outdoor stuff, and I've done a lot of that, boy, the box sitting outside, say on a concrete slab or mounted to a pole or a side of a building, has the sun beating on it all the time. So you have thermal radiation to think about, as well as passing air through it or trying to circulate the air and keep the delta between the in and out something acceptable for the transmitter to handle. So that's a problem. I've seen some doozies.
One thing I have seen is as cell companies continually improve and miniaturize their cell sites at the base of towers, I've seen cell sites moving out of the prefab concrete buildings that they were in, moving into larger outdoor enclosures, and then moving into smaller outdoor enclosures, leaving the larger ones empty. Right. And so I've been at a number of sites where this is the case, and where in American Samoa, for example, there's a broadcaster that has been given permission to put their gear in what was an enclosure that had cellular gear in it and doesn't any longer. I don't remember if there was some cooling available for that too, but I understand the dangers there. You can cool that whole cabinet really quickly and cause moisture issues, and if the air conditioner dies, then you've got a real problem. The broadcaster's probably less financially able to fix it than the cell company was. So a lot of considerations there, but moving air and making sure it's cool.
I think very often customers try to do it themselves, and I think that's a big mistake. I think going to it, you can learn a lot from the cellular folks in terms of perhaps where they get their enclosures and use something comparable to that. And buying a commercial solution for outdoor location is probably the better way to go than trying to roll your own.
Yeah. All right. Speaking of Sam Phillips, years ago, I had a Marty STL-8 transmitter it would look like a Kintronics box. Wasn't made to be an enclosure for electronic gear. Clamped to the base of a tower, and in the wintertime we kept a 100-watt light bulb in there on so that the thing wouldn't get too cold, because it was a Marty STL-8 transmitter. Oh, yeah. Good golly, what good old days. All right, hey, we got to go. We're past time. This has been fun. Gary, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate it.
It's been fun here too. It's been fun as well. Yeah.
I appreciate your top 10. I'm going to go back and watch that again sometime here. Chris Tobin, thank you for joining us as well. Appreciate you being here.
You're welcome anytime. And Gary, thank you very much for being our guest.
Good to see you again.
Next week, by the way, our guest is Tom Hartnett with Comrex, and Tom's been on before. It's been a long time ago, and Tom's going to have big updates for us on lots of connectivity, both for radio, for audio only, and for television. We're going to learn a bit about their Live Shot program and their Earshot product as well. So tune in for that. Next week, Tom Hartnett joins us here on This Week in Radio Tech. All right, we got to run. Thanks a lot to Suncast for producing the show. Thanks so much for being there and helping us out. Thanks to Andrew Zarian, the founder of the GFQ network, where they have plenty of other fine podcasts as well. No matter what your varied interests are, you're going to find them there at gfqnetwork.com. So we'll see you next week on This Week in Radio Tech. Bye-bye, everybody.